Hey, what's going on, guys? It's Spunkify here on behalf of MMOBomb.com, and welcome to our early preview of the Ground Forces expansion for War Thunder, Gaijin Entertainment's flight combat simulator. And Ground Forces, of course, adds in tank combat, or tank gameplay, which has been a much touted feature from Gaijin Entertainment and a highly anticipated one from all the players. Now, this is, of course, going to directly compete against World of Tanks, which is the current reigning champion in terms of tank warfare games set during the World War II and up period. So I got to play around with it a little bit. The closed beta is still very much in early closed beta. There's a lot of little bugs and inconsistencies. Obviously, a lot of stuff needs to be balanced. There needs to still be quite a lot of content added. There was only one map currently available in the beta, and only two of the nations, the Germans and the Russians, actually have any tanks for you to play around with. So my experience with the game is very limited at this point, which is why this isn't a full first impressions, but I still have a lot of information to give, as well as some early thoughts on where the game could head. So the first things first, what I'm going to talk about is the tanks themselves. I'll talk about tank gameplay, and then I'll go into talking about how the War Thunder air combat actually ties into that, because remember, both the tank and the air combat are and can be intertwined, unlike World of Warplanes and World of Tanks, which are two separate games. So in terms of tanks, tank behavior number one is going to be the first thing we talk about. Very much similar to World of Tanks in the sense that you steer your tank slowly, and then you're able to maneuver your turret around. There's a delay or lag. The turret actually has to turn and aim. But unlike World of Tanks, whereby you only saw your opponent's health bar really, in War Thunder's Ground Forces, it actually acts a lot like War Thunder, the airplane version of it, or the airplane side, in that when you strike an enemy with a shot, the enemy, it'll register a certain area or a certain hit, which means enemies aren't necessarily based, their deaths are not based on how much HP they have. Their deaths are generally based on what area of the tank you hit. It's mainly positional, and that happens in World of Tanks too. You can hit someone in a lucky area, get a crit, kill them, damage a really critical area. But in War Thunder Ground Forces, it's a little bit more meaty. You can hit, say, for example, the engine. Hitting the engine doesn't necessarily immediately kill you in Ground Forces, but if the engine catches fire, the fire will spread to the rest of your tank, and eventually your tank will burn out and you will die. Much like in how War Thunder in the air, you shoot an engine, the engine fire will spread to the rest of the plane. Eventually maybe you'll lose your wing and you'll fall down like that. That system seemingly has been carried over to Ground Forces, and that alone makes tank behavior, as far as atmospheric goes, way well beyond what World of Tanks is currently. The HP system of World of Tanks, while functional, really sort of removed an element or a sense of the underdog taking on the big baddie, because in World of Tanks, the higher HP, higher tier tanks, it just simply wasn't too much health to go through with the lower tier. And now with the lower tier and Ground Forces, it could be very much conceivable. They could penetrate the enemy in a crucial area and take them out, and it doesn't seem like it would be too imbalanced, the two fighting each other. Moving on from that, though, currently in the beta, the actual maneuverability of the tanks is sort of all over the place. Tanks take a long time to turn, even at slow speeds. Of course, at high speeds, they basically can just barrel in a straight line, but at low speeds, too, they typically have a really hard time rotating or even just making slight turns. In my opinion, the tanks right now handle very poorly. Even rotating in place seemingly doesn't work half the time, or it works at a snail's pace. That being said, you can of course be further damaged in your suspension or your track, which may cause you to not be able to move, but rarely so. More times than not, you actually just get slowed down, or you can only move in one direction, say forward as opposed to reverse, because they can also damage your transmission. There are so many different parts of your tank that can be damaged, and they have individual damage models. You could be shot in the actual turret, the rotating part at the top, and that can fly off. And there's a lot more of those bits and pieces of your tank that actually come off, and you can see individual damage parts. That has been a huge improvement over World of Tanks' somewhat archaic and antiquated engine at this point. The Ground Forces engine certainly isn't just using the default textures from War of Thunder. It has its own textures and the tanks themselves have a great amount of detail. So really, really nice how that's coming along. That being said, there are some graphical issues in the beta right now. Pop-in is a huge thing. I had a huge issue with pop-in of trees and other style of foliage and what have you. There's also the issue about not being able to see certain things that you can and cannot drive over. A lot of times you can drive through small trees, but oftentimes you'll run into a tree that had a small boulder or something, and suddenly your tank cannot go over that for whatever reason. I always had an issue with tanks not being able to drive over trees that I thought were applicable size. And War Thunder, while it doesn't have it, or Ground Forces rather, while it doesn't have it all the time, there are some issues right now with getting stuck on stuff, if you will. Squirrely driving is also a huge issue, whereby if you're going down hills and you're trying to make slight adjustments to your positioning or which direction you're headed, you'll often spin out, which is kind of weird for tanks, honestly. So you'll expose your broadside very easily. So trying to navigate while being fired upon and going down a hill and sort of coming at an angle will oftentimes result in you getting unnecessarily hit, because then it takes an unnecessary amount of time to realign yourself and go straight. So those are, of course, things that I feel that Gaijin Entertainment will adjust as time goes on, and not necessarily are things that will persist into open beta and, of course, launch. Past that, of course, you have the upgrades and progression system for the tanks themselves. Those work much like they do in War Thunder, in that, War Thunder recently underwent a change in that you go and research an individual plane at a time, as opposed to just purchasing the plane slot and then purchasing that plane and its crew and adding it to your roster. A lot of people do not like this new progression system, and unfortunately that progression system did move over to Ground Forces as well. So you will progress in a certain tank, and then whatever tank you're currently in, you'll gain research points in to unlock new upgrades like better treads or camouflage, perhaps increased turret control, etc. And you have a couple of options as to what you research next, but they're all tiered. So you start with an individual tier, sort of like World of Tanks, where you start with the base upgrades, and then you can branch those upgrades out into different upgrades, etc. But in this sense that you don't necessarily, or it's not readily visible what particular upgrade leads to what, mainly because you just have like a required amount of upgrades before you move on to the next tier. Alright, atmosphere in the game, of course, is huge, mainly due to the fact that the audio in the game is very, very well done. There's really well done audio, and the graphics themselves, like I touched on before, are really well done. Impacts are also very much more volumetric as opposed to World of Tanks. When you see things get struck around you, there's a larger explosion, debris is thrown up into the air, and that changes based on what is actually hit. So if you hit rock, rock flies around, but there is no deformations in that sense. You're not going to see holes being blown open in the ground and what have you. Moving on to sort of unique features for the ground combat. Unlike World of Tanks, and this may just be because we're in such a low tier, but unlike World of Tanks, Ground Forces rather has the option to call in artillery strikes versus just being an SPG and being artillery yourself. So in some tanks you have the option to use a special ability on like the 2 hotkey. You hit that and you select an area, you get like almost an overview style map, and you can select an area, and that area will be bombarded by AI artillery off map. Now that AI artillery off map can be taken out by planes in the air, which we'll get to, but that is going to be sort of your long range approach to dealing with enemies who are trying to camp perhaps, or stay in a particular area. Speaking of camping, I noticed in the one map that was available, there was a lot of opportunity for the sides to snipe each other from their spawn points. You typically spawn in one of a couple areas on the map, and if you get into a nice position, you can actually wait for enemies to come out of their spawn and immediately hit them and strike them. And generally speaking, it resulted in quite a lot of kills, because as tanks would bunch up to leave their small progression areas, they would run into each other and be easy pickings for a couple of other tanks across the ravine in the map. And there are other ways for you to escape your starting area, but it can be very annoying just being picked apart if you're trying to go a specific route and there's already a couple of like tank destroyers set up there to pick you off. Not as much sort of like, oh my god, where did that shot come from? damage in ground forces. You still can get one shot from certain tanks. Tank destroyers, of course, have somewhat paper thin armor, so in that respect, if you get hit by a medium tank, I did oftentimes get killed, outright. But the enemy itself, you usually see the enemy that's shooting at you. They've really done a good job of making it so that you don't just get hit from somewhere out of nowhere and never saw the enemy. You typically will see them either obscured with their name or just outright as they come out into view. I never had too many opportunities of someone just hiding and shooting me from a location I could not see no matter what. So there is that improvement over World of Tanks as well. Now, moving on to how the air portion of the game plays in, because that is a lot of, a big part of the feature is being able to play with tanks and with planes. The planes seem to coincide with what the tank tier is. So if you're using biplanes, you're typically going to be fighting against planes, or tanks rather, that are in that sort of tier 2 spectrum where they're not really going to be able to do too much to you. There is the Panzerfaust, which is the anti-aircraft for the Germans that you can unlock. I unfortunately was not able to unlock it in time because it takes forever to unlock tanks currently. But it makes it very easy to take out air targets, and I would argue almost too easy right now. How it works is the map itself is pretty much a normal sized War Thunder map. Large area, you can fly around, takes quite a long time to go from one side to the other, but currently the tanks themselves are located on just a small portion of the map. Now, as a plane, you spawn across the map and you can fly wherever. You can dogfight in the air, completely separate from where the tanks are. But if you gravitate towards there, which normally you would, given that this is the closed beta, you'll be able to sort of see your teammates in their tanks, and not really see the enemy unless either A, your teammates have already spotted them, or B, you fly over them and look yourself. So it makes it very, very difficult to actually pinpoint tanks and try to take them out. On top of that, the whole area where the tanks are is surrounded by AI, and it seems like comparatively to the AA that is in War Thunder Vanilla, in the air, the AI controlled one, it does a lot more damage and is a lot more accurate. And that may be because A, I was in a biplane and I don't remember last time I flew into AA with a biplane, or B, because you're also flying a lot closer in planes to try and take out those tanks. You start off with just machine guns, of course, on your biplanes, and they deal practically no damage to tanks. You can maybe get some suspension damage or track damage, but you're not going to be taking out tanks largely just with machine gun fire. The tanks, on the other hand, they can both shoot you with normal rounds or with high explosive rounds, or if you happen to play Panzerfaust, you can actually, I hope I'm saying that right, I hope that's actually what the anti-aircraft gun tank is for Germans. I've just been talking about it. But if you play the anti-aircraft tanks, it is very easy to shoot the enemy down, I've noticed. And they can basically tear your wings to pieces in just a few good hits if you're not really close or careful with your strafing runs. I have noticed quite a lot of people fly in and just strafe too low and then hit trees or hit a tank. You can damage a tank by running into it. And in fact, if you're on the ground and you're a tank, you can ram another tank, flip it over maybe, and blow it up that way, which is pretty awesome to do. So ramming it certainly does a lot more damage, but also adds in a little bit of element, can I flip them over? So yeah, in the game right now, the objectives don't really coincide very well with air. So on the ground, in the current map, the ground tanks will try to take 3 locations, 3 bases, if you will. You have to stay on them for a certain amount of time to capture it. The longer you hold those bases, the more tickets that you take away from the enemy, until, of course, you're the winner and the enemy is the winner. Outside of that, they're, of course, killing the tanks themselves. And then you can also shoot at the AA with your tanks as well, but generally speaking, the aircraft handle that. Otherwise, there aren't really any objectives. And I imagine that with the different maps introduced eventually, there'll be different objectives, of course, different amount of bases or things that you have to destroy. And overall, I like that better than War of Tanks, rather, in the sense that you don't have to kill each other, because already everybody has so many tanks they can respond with. Not only that, but also because of the fact that you don't maybe get some, scout tanks behind your line sitting in your base while you're out and about, and you're having to lug yourself all the way back to your base to sort of get them out of your little contested area that they can win the game by default that way. I like this ticket system way better. It makes it much more proactive and a lot less sort of campy, if you will. So yeah, right now War Thunder Air plays very little part in the tank metagame. I'd imagine as you move up the tiers, maybe there's more introduced, more involved with the tanks and the air at the same time. I do know that the biplanes can unlock bombs for them to drop on tanks, which they have to get, of course, closer to do so, but they can do so. So obviously planes will have a greater impact on tank as the tiers go up. But currently there's only like 2 tiers available, so you don't really get any options to explore that right now, which is why it's a preview. Outside of the matches themselves, the interface is practically the same thing as War Thunder. You can upgrade your individual crewmen, things like their keen vision, being able to see people from farther away, or being able to aim better or aim quicker, repair their tank quicker, all the stuff that you would expect to see from the air version of War Thunder, just sort of reapplied and retweaked for the ground forces version. So similar in that respect, you have different tabs of different tank commanders and gunners and loaders and all of those guys for you to put points in. It seems like there's more things for you to put points into, crew skill points, than there was in the air version, but that may just be me remembering. Overall, though, I'm very excited to see where Ground Forces is headed. I'm still a little bit tentative. I don't really know how the game will play out at the higher tiers. I'm really sort of worried that we won't have enough tank diversity. I mean, we do have tank destroyers, medium tanks. I'm assuming we'll have light tanks and heavy tanks. No real word, though, on artillery, and maybe people will like that, maybe people won't. But the map itself right now, very diverse, a lot of different areas for you to explore, and a lot of different tactics for you to try, because you don't have to worry about losing your one tank. You can bring multiple tanks, and some tanks actually have more reserve than other. One thing that did change from War Thunder to Ground Forces is the fact that in War Thunder, when you lose a plane, you maybe only can get another plane if you have it on reserve, which is a cash shop item, basically use the plane again. But in War Thunder, certain tanks have multiple respawns. So you can say a tank destroyer, you can use that 3 times, and then you cannot any longer use a tank destroyer of that type. Other ones have only like 1 respawn. Some of them have 2. It just depends on the tank, it seems. But that was sort of an interesting thing, that your tank of a particular type could have multiple respawns. You could use it multiple times. So overall, that is going to be sort of my early, divulging of information from the beta. As the beta progresses and new things are added, we may come back and do obviously the full first impressions of the Ground Forces beta. Currently it only is open 2 days a week, and there is no streaming allowed, so we can't actually bring you any streaming of the game as of now. But of course, stay tuned to MMOBomb.com for more information. You can find out more information on Ground Forces alone by checking the link below. I'll have a couple of articles to some more gameplay from the developers, as well as new information regarding how the game will play that I may or may not have forgotten to include here. Otherwise, guys, until next time, Spunkify out. Later, guys.